Hi everyone, I wanted to give a short talk about evaluating research for evidence-based practice, realizing that you are moving from your bachelor's degree, some instances a master's degree, to the DMP. I wanted to get some work in on explaining about critiquing research. And so again, we have been looking at evidence-based practice, which is the conscientious, explicit, and judicious use of current best evidence in making decisions about the care of, you fill in the end of that, your population, or making decisions about the procedure of, and you would fill in the end of that. It's using a variety of science and social science research and evaluation methods to pull this information together. So working in Sigma Theta Tau, which is our scholarly body of nurse fraternity, and LaSalle is the Kappa Delta chapter. If you want to consider becoming a member of our Kappa Delta. If you are not a member, contact me. I can recommend you as a community member. It does look very good on a resume. It does give lots of information on best evidence and how to do research. It has a journal, and if you're not currently a member, which many of you may be, up your dues, pay your dues, and start to use the information and journal that's available to you. They have good information. Back to what Sigma says about evidence-based practice is it's the integration of the best evidence, and remember, the evidence is the research studies. It includes nursing expertise. Your clinical experience does come into using evidence-based practice, and then the values and preferences of the communities or the population that is served. The internal evidence is the nurse's clinical experience and the client's preferences. The external evidence that's gathered in this big picture is the research, reports, professional guidelines, clinical papers, and white papers that can be considered. And then again, always cultural sensitivity, culturally appropriate interventions, and financially appropriate interventions need to be considered. If you're looking at evidence for a thermometer and they find that, I saw one at Abington, they roll the thermometer across the forehead versus the strip, and one costs $600 for the rolling temperature versus $1 for each forehead strip. What's more valuable? What's financially appropriate for your organization? If you're in a clinic that sees a lot of fevers, maybe the roll across the forehead is really going to be financially appropriate. If you're in a smaller office that is maybe OBGYN, that's not typically taking temperatures on a regular basis, maybe it's financially more sensitive to just buy the strips. But these are all the things that are considered when you're making, when you're pulling together evidence for evidence-based practice. So again, this triangle, it's a little bit fuzzy, but talks about the external evidence on the left of the triangle, the clinical expertise and expert opinion, and the bottom client caregiver. All of these form together because you're not going to present something to your population that is socially unacceptable or culturally unacceptable to them, even though the scientific evidence says that it's appropriate or that it works. So then you're going to use your clinical experience and your expert opinion to say, how can we adapt that? How can we change perceptions? How can we change the affective behavior or the cognitive cognitive domains of the thinking of my population? But again, you're taking the external and the internal evidence and the culturally and financial evidence to pull together. So here we go. We talked about the ways of knowing in the discussion board. And remember, the empirical is that scientific, objective reality of knowing. What is this? What's in front of us? What can we measure and touch? Objective. The aesthetic is the transformative acts. How is this significant to my client, to nursing? The personal, which is the expression of the self. Do I know what I do, and is it caring for the client, and then the ethical knowledge and the moral behavior. Is it right to do this? Is it reasonable to do this? And again, that's these ways of knowing in nursing are part of that internal evidence that we're asking about, your clinical expertise and your expert opinion based on your empirical, aesthetic, personal, and ethical knowledge that you have been developing in your career. Okay, so when you're choosing the evidence, you're going to choose keywords to search for pertinent studies, because you could put in the word diabetes and you will get probably more than 10,000 research studies related to it. So you need to begin to narrow it down. Is it screening for diabetes? Is it glucose measurement in diabetes? Is it foot care? Is it, we all know the topics related to diabetes. And so you really want to save yourself time and narrow down using keyword searches and the Boolean logic that CINAHL and Medline and PubMed all present to you. You want to evaluate certain sections of the evidence, and again, I gave you the evaluating evidence in the beginning, the forms for evaluating quantitative and qualitative research. And again, in this class, we're only going to be looking at and considering some of those sections, because we're bringing you back into scholarly thinking of research. Perhaps you've been working on that. I don't want to cut anyone short. Perhaps you've worked on studies and worked on evidence-based projects in your work site. But you know, we'll make sure that everyone is up together. And if you have more knowledge, absolutely you can use that in your presentations. You want to annotate the article on your slide so that everybody knows what study you are talking about, and then you want to give a summary of it. So consider the highlighted areas, the yellow areas on the evaluation of quantitative research for this beginning. Sample is important to consider, because if you are working in a rural area with a rural population, those populations can have very different needs and abilities and services and things available to them than an urban population. So sample location is important to consider when you're evaluating this study. If you're looking at elders, such as I'm going to give you an example in the next YouTube video you can listen to, are wheelchair dependent individuals the same as senior citizens? What are the differences? Can we think in terms that there's some similarities, but they're not exactly the same? So don't limit your studies. So don't do a diabetic search for diabetes 65 and older, because that population, again, doesn't give us enough information. And there may be other populations that can be, there are other studies done on populations that outcomes could be similar. Look at the discussion section. This is where the researchers are telling you what they did great, what they missed, what needs further to be done, whether it's generalizable. And again, consider generalizability, taking the results from this sample to the population. Can we expand the view that the people in this population would respond the same if they were in the study? Look at what's statistically significant in the study, because that will tell you then that it is generalizable. What parts are generalizable to the population and what parts are not. Read the limitations and also consider what the author might not have considered. And this is where you bring in your clinical expertise and what your experiences have been. So if say they're testing the model about falls, and they say that I don't know, the bed alarm is the best method for preventing falls, but you know that people don't stay in bed all day, so there has to be something to prevent falls from people who get up from a chair, which is therapeutic, that somebody is sitting in the chair. So again, look at the studies and think about, would that work in my population? Does that make sense? How does our policy differ? would I change because of the results of this study? Those are the things you're considering based on your clinical expertise. Another thing you want to look for is bias in the research study. And again, these are peer-reviewed, but bias can come through as a result of errors in how they chose their sample, how they chose their design, or for other confounding factors that are considered. Now, let me tell you that no research study is perfect. There's always cases of internal, external validity issues, bias issues. As long as the author addresses them in the discussion section, it means they have tried to perhaps control for it, but couldn't, but feel the statistical significance is still there because of the way they explain it. Selection bias is how the sample is chosen. So convenient samples mean it was easy. You know, if you're testing a drug, a selection bias, choosing a sample of prisoners, which we know is not allowed because they perhaps are desperate and you're offering money, people are going to come in, and then you might not get a good example of the population from the sample. You might have prisoners that have certain similar issues that would bias your results. Misclassification bias is inclusion-exclusion criteria. So maybe somebody counted this level as being diabetic, you know, a level of 100, and that was easy to lose some weight and get that blood sugar down, which is not a true classification of diabetes, something like that. And then confounding factors are some third factor that's not accounted for or expected. You know, these are things you can think about. Diagnostic, the DRGs came into effect, and that threw off how my results, how nurses responded to my results because they were so concerned with electronic medical records. It could be a confounding factor. All of a sudden, the hospital switched in the middle of your study, and nurses became very stressed, and your whole project fell apart. So those are confounding factors that should be addressed, that should be considered. Okay, so again, consider your sample and compare it to your population. Consider themes that come out of the research. Is it themes that you're looking for? Oh, I'm sorry, this is qualitative evidence. The themes are the results, came out of the interviews with the clients, and so this tells us a lot about that group of that experience that the people are having. What questions does the research raise, and does it give you insight into your population? Qualitative evidence should give you insight. So if you are talking about single mothers and babies in NICUs, and suddenly you have a qualitative article on fathers and NICUs, that does not really address your population or your concerns, because you're concerned about the mother and preemies. You're not concerned, single mothers and preemies. You're not concerned about the father's view. So you want to pick qualitative evidence that pertains to your research topic. Okay, so we've come to the end. I hope this is helpful. I think that if you look at the evaluation of quantitative research, we're not focusing on the results, looking at whether the correct statistical test was done. You will develop those skills when you have your research class, when you're starting to look at your project. But we are not going to include that in the evaluation or critique for our projects in 702. So thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. Please put any questions you have on the discussion board. Thank you.